The rain battered against the car windows, turning the world outside into a blur of gray and shadows. Lucas huddled in the back seat, his arms wrapped around his small frame. His Aunt Martha sat silently at the wheel, her face tight with worry and something else, something colder. The windshield wipers swiped furiously, but it seemed no match for the storm that had rolled in, thick and angry. "We're almost there," Martha said, her voice sharp, though Lucas could hear the nervous edge beneath it. He looked up at her, searching for answers in her expression, but she kept her eyes on the road, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. Lucas turned his gaze back out the window, watching as trees blurred past. The roads were unfamiliar, winding deeper into the forest. He hadn't asked where they were going. He hadn't asked much of anything since his parents died. It had only been a few months, but the weight of their loss hung on him like a shroud. He hadn't been able to shake it, and Aunt Martha didn't seem to know what to do with him. The car turned onto a narrow, gravel path, the tires crunching loudly over the stones. Ahead, through the curtain of rain, Lucas saw the outline of a large house. Its dark silhouette loomed over the landscape, crooked and eerie. Martha pulled the car to a stop in front of the house, the headlights casting an unsettling glow on its weathered walls. "We're here," she muttered, though she didn't seem relieved. Lucas stared at the house, feeling a chill creep up his spine. The mansion looked like it hadn't been inhabited in years. Its windows were dark, and the paint was peeling from the wooden boards. There was something about it that felt wrong. Martha climbed out of the car, pulling her coat tight around her. "Come on, Lucas. Let's get you inside." He hesitated, glancing at her through the rain-spattered window. "What is this place?" She paused, her back to him. "It's your uncle's house. He'll look after you for a while." Before he could question her further, she opened the door and tugged him out of the car. The rain immediately soaked through his clothes, making him shiver as they hurried up the steps to the front door. Martha banged the brass knocker twice, her movements tense. For a long moment, nothing happened. Lucas could hear the pounding of his heart in his ears, almost louder than the rain. Then slowly, the door creaked open. A tall figure stood in the doorway, cloaked in shadow. "Gerald," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is Lucas." The figure stepped forward into the faint light of the porch. Uncle Gerald was a tall man, his face gaunt and his eyes cold. He looked down at Lucas with an expression that sent a shiver through him, though the man said nothing. Instead, he merely stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. The house smelled of dust and dampness, the air heavy and oppressive. Lucas took in the dark wooden floors, the peeling wallpaper, and the old, faded furniture. It felt like a place that had been forgotten by time. "Take care of him," Martha said quickly, turning back toward the door. "I'll be back soon." Lucas spun around, panic rising in his chest. "Wait, you're leaving me here?" Martha avoided his gaze, her hand already on the doorknob. "It's only for a little while. You'll be fine." And then, before he could protest, she was gone. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving Lucas standing alone in the dim, unfamiliar house with a man he didn't know and a storm raging outside. Uncle Gerald's footsteps echoed in the hall as he walked ahead of Lucas, his long, dark coat trailing behind him. Lucas stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door, willing Aunt Martha to come back. But all he heard was the howling wind and the relentless beat of the rain. He swallowed hard and turned to follow his uncle deeper into the house. "This way," Gerald said, his voice as cold as the air that seemed to seep from the walls. Lucas's eyes darted around the dimly lit foyer as they moved through the house. The furniture was old and covered in dust, the kind of place that seemed to exist only in old stories. A large, winding staircase led to the upper floors, its railings intricately carved but dulled by age. Portraits of stern-looking men and women lined the walls, their eyes following Lucas as he walked by. "Your room is upstairs," Gerald said, leading him up the creaky staircase. "You'll stay there until I tell you otherwise." The hallway upstairs was even darker, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. Uncle Gerald stopped at a door at the far end of the hall and pushed it open. Inside was a small room with a single bed, a wardrobe, and a small window that looked out onto the rain-soaked landscape. "This will be your room," Gerald said flatly. "Dinner is at 8. Don't be late." Without another word, Gerald turned and left, closing the door behind him. Lucas stood in the middle of the room, feeling a strange emptiness settle over him. The room was cold, and the window rattled slightly as the wind pushed against it. He walked over to the window and looked outside. The view was bleak. Trees swayed violently in the storm, and beyond them, he could barely make out the gravel road they had driven in on. His heart sank as he realized how isolated the house was. As Lucas unpacked his small bag, he heard a soft knock on the door. Startled, he turned to see a woman standing in the doorway, her expression neutral. "I'm the maid," she said in a low voice. "Dinner will be ready soon." Lucas stared at her, unsure of what to say. There was something unsettling about her presence, something he couldn't quite place. "You shouldn't wander around," she added, her voice almost a whisper. "Some rooms aren't meant to be opened." Before he could respond, she turned and disappeared down the hall, her words lingering in the air like a warning. Lucas sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door. The house felt wrong. It was as if the walls themselves were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He had a sinking feeling that Aunt Martha wasn't coming back anytime soon. The days that followed Aunt Martha's abrupt departure were a blur of quiet meals and cold, uninviting rooms. Lucas spent most of his time in his small, dusty bedroom, where the storm outside seemed to never cease. At night, the wind howled through the old walls, rattling the windows and keeping him awake. He'd grown used to the oppressive silence that filled the mansion, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the soft whispers of the wind. Uncle Gerald rarely spoke to him. He would appear at meal times, sitting at the long dining table in eerie silence, his eyes always on Lucas, but his words few and far between. The maid, too, was a shadow in the house. Her presence was fleeting, her movements almost ghost-like as she tended to the house in silence. But what disturbed Lucas the most were the closed doors. Nearly every room in the mansion was locked, and when he asked Uncle Gerald about them, he was met with cold indifference. "Some doors are better left closed," his uncle would say, offering no further explanation. Lucas's curiosity, however, continued to grow. There was one door in particular, at the end of the long upstairs hallway, across from his room, that seemed to call to him. The door was old and worn, its paint chipped and peeling, but it was always locked. Every time he passed it, he felt a strange pull toward it, as though something important lay just beyond. One afternoon, when Uncle Gerald had disappeared to some unknown part of the mansion and the maid was nowhere to be found, Lucas decided to investigate. He crept down the hall, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood before the door, his hand hovering over the handle. "Just a peek," he whispered to himself. What could it hurt? To his surprise, the door creaked open. It hadn't been locked after all. Inside was a small room, dimly lit by the faint light that filtered in through the cracked window. Dust covered every surface, and the air smelled of age and neglect. The room itself seemed unremarkable, with only a few pieces of old furniture and a large wardrobe against the far wall. But then Lucas's eyes fell on something that made his breath catch. A series of photographs scattered on the floor. He knelt down and picked one up, his hands trembling slightly. It was a picture of his parents. They were younger in the photo, standing in front of the very mansion he now found himself in. His mother was smiling, her arm around his father's shoulders, and they both looked happy. But what struck Lucas was that they had never mentioned this place. He'd never even known they had any connection to it. He shuffled through the other photographs, finding more of his parents, some of them standing with Uncle Gerald, though much younger. There were also pictures of people Lucas didn't recognize. Family members, perhaps, but none that had been part of his life. At the bottom of the pile was a letter, yellowed with age and addressed to his father. Lucas unfolded it carefully, scanning the faded words. "The curse is real. You know it as well as I do. We cannot escape it." Lucas's heart raced as he read on. The letter went on to describe something dark, something tied to their family's history and the mansion. It mentioned rituals, sacrifices, and a curse that had been passed down through generations. You must keep Lucas safe. He is the last hope. His name was in the letter. His father had written about him, about needing to protect him from this curse. But Lucas had never been told any of this. His parents had died in an accident, or so he had been led to believe. Tucking the letter into his pocket, Lucas felt a chill run through him. Whatever had happened to his parents was somehow tied to this house, and now he was part of it too. That night, Lucas lay awake in bed, the weight of the letter heavy in his mind. The rain continued to pound against the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. But it wasn't the storm that kept him awake. It was the growing sense of dread that had settled in his chest. His parents had known about the curse. They had tried to protect him. But from what? As his thoughts churned, a sound drifted through the silence of the house. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps echoing down the hall. Lucas sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The footsteps were getting closer. He held his breath, listening intently as they stopped right outside his door. His body tensed as the doorknob rattled slightly, then went still. For a moment, all was quiet. Then, the door creaked open. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't see anyone in the doorway, but he felt a presence, a cold, suffocating presence that made his skin crawl. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, as though something was lurking just out of sight. He waited, frozen in place, but nothing happened. The door remained open, the hall beyond empty. Slowly, cautiously, Lucas climbed out of bed and tiptoed to the doorway. He peered out into the hall, his eyes scanning the darkness. The footsteps had stopped, but something felt off. The air was thick, oppressive, and the silence was too heavy. It was as if the house itself was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. Suddenly, a faint whisper reached his ears. He couldn't make out the words, but it was close, too close. Lucas's heart raced as he looked around, his hands trembling. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Then, without warning, the door to the locked room at the end of the hall creaked open on its own. Lucas's breath quickened as he stared at the open door. It hadn't been locked when he'd entered earlier, but now it felt like it was inviting him back. The same pull he had felt before was even stronger, urging him toward the room. Against his better judgment, Lucas stepped into the hallway, his bare feet silent on the cold floor. The door remained open, waiting. He approached it slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. The shadows inside the room seemed to shift as he drew closer, and that eerie whispering grew louder. Just as he reached the door, something cold brushed against his arm. Lucas gasped, spinning around, but there was no one there. The hall was empty, yet the feeling lingered, that something was watching, something unseen but very much present. With trembling hands, Lucas pushed the door open wider and stepped into the room. Lucas's heart pounded as he stepped into the room once more. The photographs and the letters still lay where he had left them, scattered on the floor. But this time, his eyes were drawn to something he hadn't noticed before, a dusty leather-bound book on a small table in the corner. The book was old, its spine cracked, and the pages yellowed with age. It looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity tugged at him again. His fingers trembled as he picked up the book, the cover stiff under his touch. He wiped the dust from it, revealing an embossed title in faded gold letters, The Ashwood Journal. A chill ran down his spine. The name Ashwood was familiar. It was his family name. He opened the book, and as he flipped through the pages, the faint scent of old paper filled the air. Inside, he found journal entries handwritten in a neat script. The ink had faded over time, but the words were still legible. The first entry was dated over 100 years ago. The Ashwood family has been bound to this place for generations. It is our burden, our curse, and there is no escape. The house knows our secrets, and it will not let us go until the price has been paid. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. He flipped further, reading each entry with growing dread. The journal detailed the history of his family, stretching back centuries, each generation recording their experiences in the mansion. There were entries about strange occurrences, unexplained deaths, and the creeping presence of something dark lurking within the house. We thought we could break the curse, but the house will not allow it. Those who try to leave are drawn back. There is no escape. Lucas's hands shook as he turned to the next page. The entries grew more frantic as the years passed. Each writer seemed more desperate, more fearful. The mansion had consumed them all, one by one. And now Lucas understood why Uncle Gerald had been so distant, why Aunt Martha had been so quick to leave him here. They were all afraid of the house, afraid of the curse. But then a new entry caught his eye. It was dated just a few years before his birth. We've learned that the curse will pass to the next generation. My wife and I must protect our child. Lucas is our only hope. The word sent a jolt through him. His parents had known about the curse. They had tried to protect him. But how? Why had they never told him? As Lucas turned the page, he found a folded piece of paper tucked between the journal's pages. It was another letter, but this one was addressed to his mother, written in his father's handwriting. We cannot stay. The house is dangerous. We'll take Lucas far from here and break the cycle. We will find a way, even if it means leaving everything behind. Lucas's eyes widened. His parents had planned to escape the mansion, to break the curse, but something had gone terribly wrong. They had died in an accident, or so he had been told. But now, Lucas wasn't so sure. As he stood there, holding the letter, he felt the weight of the house pressing down on him. It wasn't just the curse that was dangerous. It was the house itself. It wanted something from him, something that had been passed down through generations. And now Lucas was the next in line. The journal felt heavy in Lucas's hands as he walked back to his room. His mind raced with questions, but the more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The curse, the house, his parents' deaths. It was all connected. But what was he supposed to do now? As he stepped into his room, he froze. The maid was standing by his bed, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't look surprised to see him, but there was something different about her now, something more ominous. You've been in the wrong rooms, she said, her voice low and steady. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The maid took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. I warned you not to wander. There are things in this house you don't understand, things that should be left alone. I wasn't doing anything, Lucas stammered, clutching the journal tightly to his chest. Her gaze flicked down to the book in his hands, and her expression darkened. That journal should never have been found. Lucas backed up a step, the cold grip of fear tightening around him. What do you mean? Why shouldn't I know about this? This is my family. The maid's lips pressed into a thin line. Knowing the truth doesn't mean you can escape it. The house has its ways, and it has already claimed too much. You're walking down a dangerous path, Lucas. What do you know about the curse? He demanded, his voice shaking but stronger now. Why won't anyone tell me the full story? For a moment, the maid's mask of indifference cracked. She glanced over her shoulder as if checking to see if anyone was listening, then lowered her voice to a whisper. Your family tried to escape. They all did, but the house doesn't let go. Your parents, they thought they could break the curse, but it cost them everything. Now it's your turn. My turn for what? Lucas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before she could answer, a shadow appeared in the doorway. Uncle Gerald stood there, his tall frame filling the entrance, his eyes cold and sharp. That's enough. The maid stepped back, her face returning to its blank expression. He's been asking questions, sir. I see, Uncle Gerald said, his voice calm, but laced with something darker. His eyes locked on Lucas. The boy is curious. That's natural. But you're asking the wrong questions, Lucas. Lucas stood his ground, clutching the journal tighter. Why won't you tell me the truth? What happened to my parents? Uncle Gerald's expression didn't change, but his gaze grew harder. Your parents tried to defy the house. They thought they could outrun their fate. But no one escapes the Ashwood legacy. I'm not like them, Lucas said, his voice shaking. I won't let this house control me. Uncle Gerald let out a low chuckle, though there was no warmth in it. You think you have a choice? The house chooses. You'll learn that soon enough. With that, Uncle Gerald turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The maid lingered for a moment longer, her eyes full of something Lucas couldn't quite read. Fear, perhaps, or pity. Then, without another word, she followed after him, leaving Lucas standing alone in his room. The house was quiet once more, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unseen force. Lucas looked down at the journal in his hands, his mind swirling with questions and fear. Whatever was coming, he knew one thing for certain: it was only a matter of time before the house made its move. The next few days passed in a blur of dread and curiosity. Lucas barely slept, haunted by what he had read in the journal and the maid's cryptic warnings. Uncle Gerald's presence had become an unbearable weight in the house, his cold eyes always watching, always knowing. But the more Lucas learned, the more he realized he couldn't let the fear paralyze him. He had to understand the curse. If there was any chance of escaping it, he needed to know what he was up against. The journal had given him pieces of the puzzle, but it wasn't enough. Lucas was certain the mansion held more secrets, buried in its forgotten rooms and hidden places. There had to be something that would explain the curse in full, something that would help him understand why his parents had tried to run. The storm had finally cleared, leaving the mansion shrouded in an eerie calm. Lucas decided this was his chance to dig deeper. He waited until after dinner, when Uncle Gerald retreated to his study, and the maid was preoccupied with cleaning. Slipping silently out of his room, Lucas headed back to the mysterious room at the end of the hall. This time, he wasn't looking for photographs. He was looking for answers. Inside the room, the air felt heavier, as though the shadows themselves were pressing in on him. The photographs lay undisturbed on the floor, but Lucas's eyes were drawn to the wardrobe in the corner, the one he hadn't opened before. With a deep breath, he approached it, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for the handle. The wardrobe creaked open, revealing rows of dusty clothes, but it was what lay behind them that made Lucas's heart skip a beat. There, hidden in the back, was a small compartment. Inside was a stack of old papers, brittle with age, and a large, leather-bound book that looked even older than the journal. The cover of the book was embossed with a strange symbol, a circle with intricate markings that Lucas didn't recognize. The pages crackled as he opened it, revealing handwritten notes in the same script as the journal, though the handwriting was more erratic, more desperate. The curse was born here, in this house. It feeds on the bloodline, taking what it is owed from each generation. We thought we could control it. We were wrong. Lucas's blood ran cold as he read on. The book detailed the origin of the curse, passed down from one generation of the Ashwood family to the next. It described how the house was not just a home, but a prison, a living entity that demanded payment from the family for sins long forgotten. The house chooses its sacrifice. It will take from us what it needs to survive. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, finding entry after entry that spoke of rituals, failed attempts to break the curse, and the slow unraveling of those who lived in the mansion. Each generation had tried to escape the fate that awaited them, and each had failed. There is no escape. The house will have its due. Lucas felt the weight of the words settle on him like a shroud. This wasn't just about his parents. This was about him. He was the next in line, the next Ashwood the house would claim. He was the payment it demanded. As he reached the final pages of the book, a small piece of parchment fell out, fluttering to the floor. Lucas picked it up and unfolded it, revealing a simple drawing of the same strange symbol that was on the cover of the book. Below it were the words, "The sacrifice is inevitable. Only blood will end it." Lucas stared at the parchment, his heart pounding in his chest. Was this what his parents had tried to stop? Was this the reason they had died? Before he could think further, a noise outside the room made him freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps heading toward the door. Lucas's mind raced. He couldn't be found here, not with the book in his hands. He quickly stuffed the book and the parchment into his coat pocket and slid out of the room, closing the door quietly behind him. His heart raced as he crept down the hallway, slipping into his own room just as the footsteps reached the end of the hall. He pressed his ear to the door, holding his breath. The footsteps stopped outside the locked room, then continued down the hall. Uncle Gerald. He must have known Lucas was close to uncovering the truth. Lucas sat down on his bed, the weight of the book and the knowledge of the curse pressing down on him. The house wanted him. The curse was alive, breathing through the walls of the mansion, waiting for him to make his next move. But Lucas wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. The next morning, Lucas made up his mind. He couldn't stay silent any longer. Uncle Gerald had been hiding the truth from him, maybe even from the rest of the family. But Lucas wasn't going to let him control the situation. He had to confront him, had to find out the truth about his parents, the curse, and why this house seemed so hungry for him. Lucas waited until after breakfast, when Uncle Gerald retired to his study, as he did every day. Gathering his courage, Lucas knocked on the heavy wooden door, his heart pounding in his chest. Enter, came the cold, familiar voice. Lucas pushed the door open and stepped into the study. It was a dark room, lined with shelves of old books and papers. The air smelled of leather and dust. Uncle Gerald sat behind a large desk, his sharp eyes immediately locking onto Lucas. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I need to talk to you," Lucas finally said, his voice firmer than he expected. Uncle Gerald raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting for Lucas to continue. "I know about the curse," Lucas said, pulling the leather-bound book from his pocket and placing it on the desk. "I found this. I know what this house is, and I know what it wants." Uncle Gerald's eyes flickered to the book, and for the first time, Lucas saw something in his expression, a crack in his cold, indifferent demeanor. "Fear." "So," Uncle Gerald said slowly, his voice quiet but dangerous. "You've been digging where you shouldn't." "I had to," Lucas said, his hands trembling slightly as he clenched them into fists. "You've been lying to me. My parents didn't die in an accident, did they? They were trying to escape the curse." Uncle Gerald's lips tightened into a thin line. For a long moment, he didn't respond, his gaze piercing through Lucas. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a low sigh. "They were foolish," he said, his voice laced with disdain. "They thought they could outrun their fate. But no one escapes the Ashwood legacy. Not them, and not you." Lucas's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to hold Uncle Gerald's gaze. "What is this house? Why does it want us? Why won't it let us leave?" Uncle Gerald's expression hardened. "The house is bound to the family. It is tied to the bloodline. It gives us power, wealth, and everything we need. But in return, it takes what it is owed." "What does that mean?" Lucas asked, his voice rising. "What does it take?" Uncle Gerald stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Sacrifice," he said, his voice cold and final. "It takes a life, and it will take yours." Lucas took a step back, his heart racing. "No, I won't let it." Uncle Gerald's eyes darkened. "You don't have a choice. The house has already decided. Your parents tried to defy it, and look what happened to them. Do you really think you can succeed where they failed?" "I'll find a way," Lucas said, his voice shaking but determined. "I won't let this house control me." Uncle Gerald laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "You're just a boy. You don't know what you're up against." "I know enough," Lucas said, his fist clenched. "And I'm not going to be its next victim." Uncle Gerald's face twisted into a sneer. "Then you'll die trying?" Without another word, Lucas turned and walked out of the study, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know how, but he was going to find a way to break the curse. He had to. The air in the mansion felt different after Lucas's confrontation with Uncle Gerald. There was a new, unsettling tension that seemed to cling to every corner, every shadow. It was as though the house itself had overheard their conversation and was now making its move, growing impatient for Lucas to fulfill his role in the cursed legacy. Lucas spent the following days avoiding both Uncle Gerald and the maid, retreating deeper into his thoughts and plotting his next steps. He knew he couldn't escape yet. He needed to find more information, something that could help him fight back against the curse. But every corner of the mansion now seemed to conspire against him. Doors that had once opened easily were now stuck or locked. The windows rattled louder, the wind howling more fiercely as though it were calling out to him, beckoning him into the heart of the house's malevolent power. One night, as he lay in bed, the creaking of the floorboards outside his room stirred him awake. At first, he thought it was Uncle Gerald checking on him, making sure Lucas hadn't tried to run. But the footsteps were too slow, too deliberate. Lucas's skin prickled with unease. The footsteps stopped right outside his door, and for a moment there was silence, thick, oppressive silence. Then the door creaked open on its own. Lucas bolted upright, his heart hammering in his chest. He squinted into the darkness, but the hallway beyond was empty, bathed in the dim glow of moonlight filtering through the rain-streaked windows. Yet something felt wrong, horribly wrong. He swung his legs out of bed and stood up, his bare feet cold on the wooden floor. The door was now fully open, and the hallway stretched out before him, beckoning him to step forward. Despite every instinct telling him to stay put, Lucas felt a pull, a compulsion to follow the path that had been laid out for him. The house seemed to breathe as he stepped into the hallway. The walls pressed in closer, and the temperature dropped as if the mansion itself were trying to smother him. He walked slowly, his senses heightened, as the floor creaked beneath him with every step. The darkened corridor seemed to stretch on longer than usual, each shadow hiding unseen dangers. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, so soft that at first he thought it was just the wind. But it wasn't. The voice was real, low and indistinct, as if carried through the walls themselves. "Lucas! Lucas!" He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was calling his name. Turning his head, he saw it. A dark figure at the far end of the hall, barely visible in the gloom. It was standing still, watching him, its face obscured by the shadows. Lucas's legs tensed as terror shot through him, but he couldn't move. The figure was too far away to make out clearly, but he knew, deep down, he knew, it was waiting for him. Summoning what little courage he had left, Lucas turned and bolted down the hall, his feet pounding against the floor as he ran. The whispering grew louder, chasing him as he fled, the voice now frantic, desperate. The house groaned around him, the walls seeming to shift and pulse as he darted through the maze-like corridors. The air was thick with a presence he couldn't see but could feel in every bone of his body. He passed closed doors, each one slamming shut behind him as if the house itself were trying to trap him, box him in, cut off any path of escape. His mind raced as he tried to find a way out, his breathing ragged as panic clawed at his throat. He reached the staircase and took the steps two at a time, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to get outside, needed to breathe, to escape the suffocating grasp of the mansion. But when he reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. Lucas yanked on the handle, but it was stuck fast, as though the house had sealed it shut. He twisted and pulled with all his strength, but the door refused to give. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking as he slammed his hands against the door. "Let me out." The whispering surged around him, a cacophony of voices rising in intensity, swirling around him like a storm. He spun around, his back pressed against the door, his eyes wide as he scanned the empty hall. The shadows seemed to writhe and shift, the walls closing in on him. Then, without warning, the house went still. The whispering stopped, the air went cold, and for a moment, everything was silent. A low voice, distinct and chilling, echoed through the hall. "You cannot escape, Lucas. You belong to us now." The house had spoken. Lucas stood frozen, his back against the front door, the cold grip of fear tightening around him. The house had spoken to him. It wasn't just an entity, it was alive, and it was watching, waiting to claim him. The realization sank into him like a knife. The curse wasn't just something tied to the family, it was the house itself, and it had no intention of letting him go. His mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. The door was sealed, and he knew that if he ran back into the mansion, he would only be running deeper into its grasp. The walls, the rooms, the shadows, they were all part of its twisted game. He had to think. He had to find another way out. Footsteps approached from behind. Lucas's body tensed, his mind flashing back to the dark figure that had been watching him. But when he turned, it wasn't the shadowy figure from before. It was the maid. "Lucas," she whispered, her eyes wide with panic as she hurried toward him. "What are you doing here? You shouldn't have left your room." He stared at her, his heart still racing. "The house had spoke to me. It won't let me leave." The maid glanced around nervously, then grabbed his arm. pulling him away from the door. "You need to be careful. The house is waking up. It's more dangerous than you realize." "I know about the curse," Lucas said, his voice shaking. "I know the house is trying to take me. It wants a sacrifice." Her grip on his arm tightened, and for the first time, Lucas saw fear in her eyes. Real fear. "You're right. The house does demand a sacrifice. And you are the next in line." Lucas swallowed hard, dread pooling in his stomach. "Then why are you helping me?" The maid looked away, her face tight with emotion. "Because I've seen what it can do. I've seen it claim the lives of others. I don't want the same thing to happen to you." For a moment, Lucas felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she could help him escape. Maybe there was a way out that she knew about. But then something shifted in the air. The temperature dropped again, and the oppressive weight of the house pressed down on them both. Lucas felt it before he saw it. The presence. The house wasn't just watching them. It was closing in. "Come on," the maid urged, pulling him toward a side hallway. "There's another way out. We have to go now, before it's too late." Lucas followed her, his heart hammering in his chest. They moved quickly, weaving through the dimly lit corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Lucas glanced over his shoulder, half expecting the shadowy figure to reappear, but the hallway behind them was empty. Finally, they reached a narrow door at the back of the mansion. The maid pushed it open, revealing a set of stairs that led down into the darkness. "This way," she whispered, gesturing for Lucas to go first. Lucas hesitated, glancing at the dark stairs. Something about this felt wrong. Too easy, too convenient. But he didn't have time to think. The house was waking up, and every second they spent here brought them closer to danger. He stepped forward, descending the stairs with the maid close behind him. The air grew colder as they moved deeper underground, the walls closing in on either side. Lucas could hear the distant sound of dripping water, and the floor beneath him felt uneven, as though the foundation of the house was crumbling. Suddenly, the maid stopped. Lucas turned to look at her, his heart pounding. "What is it? Why are we stopping?" Her expression had changed. Gone was the fear, the urgency. In its place was something colder, more calculating. "I'm sorry, Lucas," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this is where it ends." Before Lucas could react, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small, silver dagger, its blade gleaming in the dim light. His blood ran cold. You're part of this?" he stammered, stepping back, his mind reeling. The maid's eyes softened with regret, but her grip on the dagger remained firm. "I didn't want to do this. But the house, it demands a sacrifice. It always has." Lucas's heart raced as the walls seemed to close in around him. He had been betrayed. The one person he thought he could trust was part of the house's dark plan all along. "I'm the last one left," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And if I don't offer you up, it will take me." Lucas stared at the gleaming dagger in the maid's hand, his heart pounding so loudly in his chest he thought it might burst. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow. His legs felt weak, and his mind raced for a way out. "You don't have to do this," Lucas whispered, stepping back slowly. His foot hit the bottom step, and he realized they were in the basement now, far from any exit. The walls around him seemed to pulse with the house's energy, as if it were feeding off his fear. The maid's eyes flickered with guilt, but her grip on the dagger remained steady. "You don't understand. The house, it's more than a curse. It's a living thing. It demands a life every generation. If I don't give it you, Lucas, it will take me." Lucas shook his head, trying to keep his voice calm despite the terror clawing at his insides. "There has to be another way. My parents tried to break the curse, didn't they? They were close, I know it." The maid's eyes widened slightly at the mention of his parents. Her hand wavered, the point of the dagger lowering just a fraction. "They tried," she said, her voice cracking. "But they failed, Lucas. They were killed for defying the house." "They weren't killed because they failed," Lucas said, his voice growing stronger as he realized he still had a chance. "They were killed because they got too close to breaking the curse. I know there's a way. I just need to find it." The maid's hand trembled. For a moment, Lucas thought she might drop the dagger. But then the cold, resigned look returned to her face, and she took a step closer. "There is no breaking the curse, Lucas. Only survival. And if I don't do this, the house will kill me." I've seen it happen before. Desperation surged through him. Lucas's eyes darted around the dark basement, searching for anything he could use to defend himself. There was nothing, just the cold stone walls and the flickering light of the dim bulb overhead. He was trapped, and he knew it. But then, as the maid took another step toward him, something clicked in his mind. The house might be alive, but it had rules that had been followed for generations. It demanded a life, yes, but maybe there was a way to manipulate those rules, to use them against the house itself. "Wait," Lucas said suddenly, raising his hands in surrender. "If you're going to do this, at least let me help you. Let me make it easier for you." The maid froze, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" Lucas took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "I'll come willingly. The house wants a sacrifice, right? If I give myself up, maybe it'll be satisfied. Maybe it won't take you." The maid's eyes flickered with uncertainty. She hesitated, lowering the dagger slightly. You do that?" Lucas nodded, his mind working furiously. He needed to buy time, to find a way out of this basement. "Yes, I'll do it. But first I need to understand how the ritual works. I want to know what's going to happen." The maid studied him for a long moment, her eyes full of doubt. But Lucas could see the fear behind her cold expression. The fear that the house would turn on her if she failed to deliver. Finally, she nodded, stepping back. "The ritual? It's simple," she said quietly. "We go to the heart of the house. There's a room, hidden deep within the mansion. That's where the sacrifice has to take place." "The heart of the house?" Lucas repeated, feeling a chill run down his spine. He had always known there was more to the mansion than met the eye, but this confirmed it. The house had a core, a place where the curse was strongest. If he could reach it, maybe he could find a way to stop it. The maid nodded, her grip on the dagger loosening slightly. "That's where it all began. It's where your ancestors made the deal that cursed the family. And it's where the house demands its payment." Lucas swallowed hard. His plan was dangerous, he knew that. But it was the only way he could buy himself more time. Time to figure out how to break the curse once and for all. "Take me there," Lucas said, his voice steady. "Let's end this." The heart of the house was exactly as Lucas had feared. A place where darkness and decay reigned. The maid led him through twisting corridors and down a hidden stairway, deep into the bowels of the mansion. The air grew colder with each step, and Lucas could feel the house closing in around him, suffocating him with its presence. At last, they reached a heavy wooden door. The maid paused in front of it, her face pale and drawn. "This is it," she whispered. "Once we're inside, there's no turning back." Lucas nodded, his mind racing. He had no intention of going through with the ritual, but he needed to get inside this room. It was the only way to understand the house, to confront the curse head-on. The maid pushed the door open, and Lucas stepped inside. The room was vast and circular, with walls made of black stone that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. In the center of the room stood a large stone altar, its surface stained with dark, rust-colored marks. Surrounding the altar were strange symbols carved into the floor. Symbols Lucas recognized from the journal and the leather-bound book. The heart of the house. This was where the curse had been born, where his ancestors had made their deadly pact. The maid walked to the altar, her hands shaking as she placed the dagger on its surface. "It's time," she said, her voice barely audible. Lucas stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room for any clues, any way to disrupt the ritual. The symbols on the floor seemed to pulse with dark energy, but there was something else, something beneath the symbols. He knelt down, running his fingers over the stone, and felt a faint outline of another symbol, one that had been scratched out. His heart raced. This was it. This was the key to breaking the curse. "Wait," Lucas said, standing up. "There's something wrong here. This symbol, it's incomplete." The maid looked at him, confusion flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Lucas took a deep breath, piecing it together as he spoke. "This ritual, it's been altered. Someone tried to hide this symbol. I think it's the symbol that controls the curse. If I can restore it, maybe I can stop the house." The maid's face paled. "You can't. The house won't allow it. I have to try, Lucas said, his voice firm. If I don't, this will never end. He knelt down and began scratching at the floor, revealing the hidden symbol. It was faint, almost invisible, but as Lucas traced its lines, he felt the energy in the room shift. The walls seemed to tremble, and the air grew colder, more oppressive. The house was fighting back. Suddenly, the maid screamed, her hands flying to her head as if she were in pain. "No, you're angering it. It won't let us leave." Lucas ignored her, his focus entirely on the symbol. He could feel the power coursing through the room, the dark energy swirling around him. But he was close, he could feel it. Just as he completed the final line of the symbol, the house let out a deafening groan. The walls shook violently, and the floor beneath him cracked open, revealing a deep, black void. Lucas stumbled back, his heart racing. The maid fell to her knees, sobbing. "You've doomed us all." But Lucas knew better. The house wasn't winning. It was losing. The curse was breaking. With a final surge of strength, Lucas stood and faced the altar. "It's over," he whispered, as the ground trembled beneath him. "The curse is broken." The walls of the mansion groaned one last time, and then, with a deafening roar, they began to collapse. As the walls of the mansion began to tremble, Lucas knew there was no turning back. The floor cracked beneath him, revealing the dark void that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. The air was thick with dust and a palpable, suffocating energy. The house was fighting for its survival, but so was Lucas. The maid screamed again, clutching her head as if the very essence of the house was tearing through her mind. Lucas spared her a quick glance, feeling a pang of guilt. She had been a pawn, just like everyone else, trapped in the web of the curse. But he couldn't help her now. There was only one way to end this. The symbol Lucas had restored glowed faintly on the floor, its intricate lines pulsing with power. He could feel the energy coursing through it, fighting against the malevolent force of the house. The mansion's groans intensified, the walls shuddering violently as cracks spread along the ceiling. Chunks of stone and wood rained down, and the floor continued to split apart, widening the dark void that threatened to swallow everything. The house wasn't just angry, it was desperate. Lucas staggered forward, his eyes locked on the altar at the center of the room. The dagger still lay there, gleaming ominously. He knew what the house wanted. It had always demanded a sacrifice. The question was, could he break the curse without giving in to that demand? His thoughts raced. He remembered the journal, the letters, the fragmented symbols. Everything pointed to this moment. The curse was tied to the bloodline, to the Ashwood family's centuries-old pact with the house. But there was a part of the ritual that had been hidden, scratched out. If restoring the symbol could weaken the curse, maybe he could use it to end the house's power once and for all. But it would require a sacrifice. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Someone had to die. It had always been this way, generation after generation. A life given to the house to keep the curse alive. But if Lucas could alter the ritual, if he could change the terms, maybe he could stop the house without giving in. His gaze flicked to the maid, still crouched on the floor, her body trembling as the house's energy coursed through her. Her eyes were wide with fear, her mind consumed by the growing chaos. "I won't let it take me," Lucas whispered to himself, his voice barely audible above the din of the collapsing house. He stepped forward, his hand hovering over the dagger. His mind raced. If he could trick the house into accepting something other than a life, maybe it would be enough to sever the connection between the Ashwood family and the curse. But what could he offer? What could he give that would satisfy the house's hunger without losing his life? Then it came to him. His parents had tried to escape, to break the curse. They had died trying. But Lucas wasn't just their son. He was the last of the Ashwood line. The house had wanted him because he was the final link in the chain. If he could sever that link, maybe the house would lose its power. He grabbed the dagger and with trembling hands, cut his palm. The pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the weight of what he was about to do. Blood dripped onto the floor, splattering across the restored symbol. Lucas closed his eyes, focusing all his willpower, all his energy, into one final thought. End it. Break the cycle. "Release us." The house groaned again, the walls shaking violently. The air crackled with dark energy as Lucas's blood soaked into the symbol, mingling with the ancient carvings. The void below the altar pulsed, hungry and demanding, but Lucas wasn't afraid anymore. He could feel the house's power waning, the curse unraveling as his blood sealed the final piece of the puzzle. Suddenly, the entire room shook with a deafening roar. The walls split open, sending clouds of dust and debris raining down around him. The void beneath the altar grew wider, darker, as the house seemed to convulse with fury. But Lucas didn't move. He stood firm, his hands still bleeding over the symbol, his body shaking, but his mind clear. This was it. The house was losing. Then, as if in response to his defiance, the void began to close. Slowly, at first, then faster. The black emptiness receded, swallowed by the collapsing floor. The ground beneath Lucas's feet steadied, the violent shaking subsiding. The walls, though still cracked, no longer groaned with the house's fury. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air lifted, leaving only the faint echo of the house's dying breath. The maid gasped, her body slumping to the ground as the energy that had gripped her was released. She looked up at Lucas, her eyes wide with shock and something like relief. "It's over," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible as he sank to his knees, exhausted. The house was silent now. The curse was broken. The ruins of the Ashwood mansion stood silent in the morning light, the once grand structure now a crumbled heap of stone and wood. Smoke and dust still lingered in the air, the last remnants of the house's slow, violent collapse. Lucas stood at the edge of the rubble, staring at what remained of the place that had held his family captive for generations. The heart of the house was gone, buried beneath the ruins. The symbols, the altar, the darkness, they were all lost in the collapse, erased from existence along with the curse that had haunted the Ashwood family for centuries. Lucas's hands still throbbed from the cut he had made, but it was a small price to pay. He had won. He had broken the curse without losing his life. But he knew that his victory had come at a cost that went beyond blood. The maid stood beside him, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't spoken much since they had escaped the house, still too shaken by the ordeal. Lucas couldn't blame her. They had both been pawns in a game they hadn't fully understood, and now, with the house destroyed, they were left to pick up the pieces. "What will you do now?" the maid asked, her voice quiet, almost timid. Lucas glanced at her, then back at the ruins. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm the last Ashwood. There's no one left to carry on the family name." The maid's eyes flickered with something like pity. "But you're free now. You broke the curse." Lucas nodded, but the weight of that freedom felt heavy on his shoulders. He had survived, yes, but the house had taken so much from him. His parents, his childhood, his sense of safety. He wasn't sure who he was without the curse looming over him. "I think," he said slowly, "I need to leave this place. There's nothing left for me here." The maid nodded in understanding. "I'll leave too. The house, it's gone, but the memories aren't." They stood in silence for a long time, watching the sunlight slowly creep over the ruins. The storm had passed, the air was still, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Lucas felt like he could breathe. As they began to walk away from the mansion, Lucas felt something shift inside him. The burden of the curse, the weight of his family's dark history, had been lifted. He had survived the house's grasp, and now, with the curse broken, he had a chance at a new beginning, a chance to live a life that wasn't defined by fear and sacrifice. But as they reached the edge of the forest, Lucas paused. Something was nagging at the back of his mind, a memory, a lingering thought. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small, folded piece of parchment he had taken from the journal. The symbol was still there, etched in faded ink. But beneath the symbol, something had changed. New words had appeared, scrawled in dark, frantic handwriting. "The house never dies. It waits. It always waits." A chill ran down Lucas's spine. He crumpled the paper in his hand, shoving it deep into his pocket. He didn't know what it meant, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. The curse was broken. The house was gone, But in the back of his mind, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, waiting in the shadows. With one last glance at the ruins, he turned and walked away, leaving the Ashwood mansion and its dark legacy behind. Hey there, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps us grow and bring you more thrilling content. We'd love to know what part of the story had the most impact on you. So drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. And if you have any ideas or suggestions for future stories you'd like to see on the channel, we'd love to hear them. Your feedback and creativity help shape our next adventures. Thanks again for being part of the community, and we can't wait to see what you come up with next.